Thank you all again for coming.
Okay, I want to make 3 points. First off, I appreciate being invited and that we're having this conference, and obviously no one anticipated this. Josh and I were joking about we're going to have a month of zombie conferences where we have all our great plans for the Clinton years. But on the plus side, I could say I've been in D.C. for a quarter century, and I've had a lot of experience playing defense. So we could do it. We could do it. Anyhow, I want to talk about I'll call it the Trump stimulus. I'm a little reluctant to call it that, but I'm going to call it the Trump stimulus as fiscal policy. And I'm going to make 3 points. First off, that I'm going to argue it can work in the sense of boosting employment. I mean, Jeff's exactly right. Supply-side economics doesn't work in its own terms. It's not going to give incentives. It can boost employment and growth, so I'm going to make that point. Secondly, I'm going to argue that there actually are substantial long-term benefits, and it's not the ones that they want to say that we're going to have a zooming economy. It's simply, well, I'll get to it in a minute. And third, I think the Democrats have unfortunately put themselves in a very bad political position vis-a-vis this policy, basically because it can work, and they've set themselves up in many ways as saying it can't, and that's going to be a very big problem. Fortunately, I'm not the political person, so I don't have to deal with that. Okay, the first point, can it work? Well, the 2 main parts that, at least I see, and others may want to emphasize other aspects, but basically we're talking about a stimulus plan or an infrastructure plan, kind of ill-defined, and then big tax cuts very much targeted towards the wealthy, as Jeff pointed out. The stimulus plan, infrastructure, again, it's not well defined. He's indicated he wants to do a lot of public-private partnerships. To my view, this is very often an invitation to graft, I think particularly with this administration. That's something to watch for. He'll probably want to evade a lot of the rules on say, Davis-Bacon Act, wages, union contracts in federal projects. These are going to be very, very big issues that we're going to have to look at closely. But the basic point, do we need more infrastructure? Obviously, yes, more better infrastructure. Will this boost demand? Sure. I mean, how could it not? Okay, so that part certainly will boost demand. When we talk about the tax cuts, well, giving Bill Gates another $1 million or whatever it is, he'll probably get a hell of a lot more than $1 million, but whatever, giving more money to the richest people in the country is not the best way to boost demand. Nonetheless, you throw a lot of money out there, it does have some boost to demand, and even more middle-income people will get some of it. We know most of it half of it goes to the top 1% from the tax policies calculations, but still, that's they'll spend some of that, and the other half, much of that will be spent. So this will be a boost to demand. Now, that matters in a context where we're below full employment, and I would argue that we are. It's very common for people to go, 5% unemployment, that's pretty much full employment. I look at the employment to population ratio. What percent of the people, and I'm focusing on prime age people, so don't tell me about retirees, we know about them, 25 to 54, they're not trying to retire. That's still down by 2 percentage points from the pre-recession level, 4 percentage points if we use 2000 as a benchmark. So that's 2.5 to 5 million people who, what I would argue, are looking for work if they could get it, or want work if they could get it. Now, there's been a big effort, and to my view, it's really been very shoddy research, or it's been interpreted in a shoddy way, saying, well, the problem is that men don't feel like working, they're watching internet porn and playing video games. The problem with that story is the same thing has happened with women. Okay, so you can't tell me that women aren't working because men are watching porn. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So basically, to my view, it's a pretty clear story. We've had a weak labor market. A lot of people drop out when they don't see a prospect for finding a job. If they had a prospect of finding a job, they would be out there working. So that's the basic argument as to why I would say we could get substantially more employment, more growth, and why something like this could work, however poorly targeted. None of our ideals is stimulus. Someone may contradict me on that, but I'm going to say that now. The second point is for the long-term implications. Well, we have a lot of people in this country, not just random people like on the Federal Reserve Board, who say we can't do better than 5% unemployment. We're at full employment. We're going to start raising interest rates. There's a lot of people on the Federal Reserve Board who say we should be raising interest rates. Some wanted to raise interest rates last year. But in any case, the point is that becomes accepted as a basis for policy. And one of the advantages of being in Washington long enough, I've seen this before. Okay, back in the early and mid-90s, you were an idiot if you thought the unemployment rate could get substantially below 6% without setting off an inflationary spiral. And that just wasn't right-wing economists. I had arguments with people like Alan Blinder, Janet Yellen, Paul Krugman, all people I respect a lot, but certainly not right-wing economists, and they all thought you could not get much below 6% unemployment without triggering spiraling inflation. Guess what? You could. We got 4% year-round average unemployment. The only way we got there was because we had this weird guy, Alan Greenspan at the Fed, who, I complain about him all the time, but for whatever my complaints, he was not a mainstream economist. He didn't accept the conventional wisdom. He was willing to challenge it, let the unemployment rate go to 4%. And as a result of that, we had a new benchmark. So after we got to 4% unemployment in 2000, no one in 2001, 2002, 2003 was saying, wow, 6% is the best we could do. But the only reason we knew that, because we had Alan Greenspan at the Fed who was prepared to let the unemployment rate go to 4%. I would say the same story applies with the current employment to population ratios. We have a lot of people who are prepared to accept, well, we just can't do any better. All those people who aren't working, they just don't feel like working anymore. They'd rather watch their internet porn. Well, we can't let that be the conventional wisdom. And however much I don't want to see this guy in the White House, this might be the way to challenge that. Okay, so I think that's a very, very important point that shouldn't be overlooked. This brings to the last point about how I'd say the Democrats have left themselves very poorly positioned. Now, I know full well, President Obama wanted a larger stimulus. There were any number of times where he asked Congress for additional spending for health care, for infrastructure, for child care, a whole range of programs. Congress, of course, said no. These Republicans, we're going to see the greatest flip-flop in the history of the world. All the people who sanctimonious about the deficits under President Obama suddenly are going to be the biggest deficit spenders ever. But that's the reality. Now, what was unfortunate is Obama let that drop. He was not continually saying, look, I want to spend more money. We need to spend more money. We need to have more stimulus. He was not constantly saying. People weren't hearing that. And if you go back to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, what did she promise about her spending? Every dollar is paid for. So there was not this constant theme saying we could do better. We could have more demand in the economy. We want larger deficits. That would be good. You were not hearing that. So that makes it very easy now for the Republicans to go out, spend a lot of money, and laugh at the Democrats. Now, again, fortunately, I'm not the political person. I don't have to deal with this. But what I will say is we have to recognize reality. It's not going to help us to deny the truth, to be, like global warming deniers. And, to my view, the reality is there's slack in the economy. Anything that increases demand will increase output, increase employment. And that's a good thing, but it's unfortunate the way it might come about. So I'll stop with that.
Okay. Thank you, Dean. And I'm sorry for being late to the panel to moderate, but I think we're going to move to Josh next to sort of, or was there another plan?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. I think I was next, but Josh.
Well, you know what? Let's go back to the original plan then, Jane, because, as we pick up on, Dean's talk about there being room for fiscal stimulus, there always comes this question of sort of where does money come from and what are opportunities to look at. We had the Clinton model that you would seek to find pay-fors, but Jane, you've done a lot of work looking at the tax base and opportunities for broadening it that would work economically, and you'd also have some comments on how it would work politically. So why don't you take it from there?
Well, so is this on? You can hear me? Actually, I agree with the austerity complaint during the recession. And, I'm not sure how close we are to full employment, but certainly at the time, I believe Tom Hungerford and I wrote a paper at the Congressional Research Service there, Can a contractionary fiscal policy be expansionary? And we actually got away with that title. Anyway, I do want to say as a disclaimer, nothing I say represents the views of the Congressional Research Service. They're just my own views. And I'm going to just, after this talk, there seems to be a lot of talk here about stimulus. I think we need to remember, and as Josh suggested, the kind of stimulus matters a great deal. And I think there's very little evidence that tax cuts for high-income people do much to stimulate because they don't spend enough. So direct spending and income tax cuts for lower-income people probably do work better. However, I want to move to a gloomy, depressing note here. That's what economists' role in life is. And that is, when we're talking about tax reform, we're not talking about a short-term spending program. We're talking about a major change, permanent change in the tax law. And these tax cuts, these permanent tax cut proposals are coming at a time when we have unsustainable growth in the debt. The current debt is 75% of GDP, according to CBO. That is the highest debt level since 1950, when the World War II debt was being paid off. In 2035, it will exceed the historical high of 106% of GDP in 1946 and continue growing. So this is an issue we will have to do something about. Now, the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center estimates that President-elect Trump's tax cut plan, will increase the debt by $7 trillion in the first decade, and analysis of the House Republican plan project an increase of $3 trillion. These amounts include the macroeconomic feedback offsets and added interest cost. They're also estimated, as noted earlier, to cut taxes proportionally more for high-income people, and it would have a deep cut in corporate taxes. So I think it's useful to consider in this tax reform framework what kind of base broadeners we might use to achieve both revenue gains and base broadeners that benefit high-income people, so we can address some of these distributional issues. Now, limiting tax expenditures provides a significant potential because individual tax expenditures, if you add them all up, account for about 70% of the individual income tax. Corporate tax expenditures about 60%, and together they account for $1.3 trillion a year. And the individual provisions are 80% of that. I have to have my cheat sheet here because I have too many numbers and I can't remember them all. So let me just say a quick word. I know we've got a panel on corporate taxes, and of course that's my great love, so I'm kind of jealous of them. But not that I love corporate taxes, I love studying them. About half of corporate tax expenditures is foreign source income. And if that is off the table, as it would be if we have a territorial tax or if we have the House Republican proposal to have essentially a cash flow destination-based tax, we won't have that revenue, we won't have any tax on foreign source income except as it comes in through imports. The remaining provisions, 10% of the corporate total is accelerated depreciation, and then there are 3 provisions that are about 5% each. The domestic production activities deduction, the deferral of gain on like-kind exchanges. This is mostly real estate and rental cars for corporations. That's what that is. And tax-exempt bond interest. Now, both of these plans either allow or direct expensing, so it doesn't look like anything is going to happen with accelerated depreciation in any of these proposals. Now, the problem with individual income taxes is, although they're much larger, they are very difficult in many ways to do something about. The largest one, which is 14% of the total, is the exclusion of employee health insurance. And we kind of already addressed this during the Affordable Care Act and ended up enacting the Cadillac tax, which is sort of a substitute for individual income taxes on high-cost health insurance proposals. The House Republican plan proposes to repeal all the Affordable Care Act, so the Cadillac tax would be among them. So if you want to eliminate the Cadillac tax, you need to think about whether you want to do something else with this provision, because that was one of the provisions that people felt really sort of changed the cost curve for health insurance. Tax benefits for capital income, there are 2 of them. The reduced rates for capital gains and dividend, 2 major ones. The capital rates and dividends, and there's also all the benefits of retirement plans, pensions, IRAs, and so forth. Each count for about 13%. The problem with the capital gains tax is that because of the scoring conventions used by the Joint Committee on Taxation, you're not going to gain much revenue from cutting that rate, at least in the official scoring sense. I think you would in reality, but by raising taxes, capital gains taxes. Pension plans, again, you're not going to eliminate them. You might do some small things like limit the size of accounts that are in thrift savings accounts or in IRAs. You might remember Mitt Romney's IRA had this huge amount of money in it. And also taxing carried interest as ordinary income. Carried interest is just earnings of people who are involved in investment partnerships like mutual funds and so forth that really should be probably should be considered as wage income instead of capital gains. Now, among the top 10 largest individual income taxes are the three major itemized deductions: the state and local tax deductions, the mortgage interest deduction, and the charitable deduction. They each account for 9%, 7%, and 4% of the totals of. I know I'm giving you a lot of numbers here, but the point is that these are big enough tax expenditures to matter in terms of a revenue effect, and also to matter in terms of having a real distributional effect. So both plans limit these deductions. The Trump plan has a $100,000 limit on itemized deductions, and the Republican plan eliminates the deduction for state and local taxes. Other options that you could have to modify the other ones are the capital gains on gifts of appreciated property. I mean, it's just amazing to me that it still is in the tax code. You can donate appreciated property, take a full deduction at ordinary rates for the contribution, and not pay any tax on the accrued capital gains. So it's a double dip for capital gains. And it also, because you don't pay capital gains taxes, it really creates an incentive to exaggerate the value of appreciated property. Another charitable deductions proposal that might be considered is putting a 2% floor. Now remember, all of these charitable deductions are still by the top 30% of people. I mean, people making contributions who don't itemize their deductions don't get any kind of benefit. But a 2% floor would actually recoup about 40% of the revenue loss from charitable contributions deduction without changing the marginal effect very much, the incentive. And it's also a message, that, maybe this is a reasonable level that you should try to strive for to make charitable deductions. And the other is disallowing deductions for interest on home equity loans, which are now allowed and are used to get around all of the interest deductions and limitations for homeowners, and reducing the $1 million cap on mortgage interest deductions. Now, another one of the top 10 that it has always seemed something very questionable to me is cafeteria plans. And a cafeteria plan is just like a cafeteria. You go through and you select items that you don't want to pay taxes on. And the main use of it is to allow people to deduct the cost of their own contributions to health insurance. It was some years ago, it was then called the 20th Century Foundation, I believe, and we had a little problem with time here, I guess, wrote a book called Tax Breaks All Around that I worked on along with, I think Eric Toder worked on it too, several other people. But we formulated a dirty dozen list of tax expenditures, and this cafeteria plan was on that list. We also had a questionable 10. And among the tax expenditures that were on these two lists that I've not already mentioned are the exemption of interest on private activity bonds. These are things that are no different from any kind of ordinary operation. It's just that they're all private investments that have a private return. And also tax-exempt interest in general, because the tax-exempt interest deduction allows, because the interest rate differential is smaller than your tax rate, you get a windfall. High-income people get a windfall from that. The exclusion of income earned abroad, the Section 911 exclusion. The exclusion of earnings on life insurance and annuities, which allows an open-ended way to defer taxes on income. You just have to have enough of a little life insurance element there to qualify. And individual retirement account benefits for those covered by pensions. For some period of time, they were not eligible. So that's kind of my list of possibilities. And I think we should take great care to look at these tax expenditures and say, are they fulfilling their purpose or not? And if not, then maybe we should think about, various ways to revise them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So you just heard, indeed. So you just heard from Jane Gravelle, Senior Specialist in Economic Policy at the Congressional Research Service. You heard first, I realize we didn't properly introduce you, Dean Baker, founder and co-president of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And we're now going to turn next to the Economic Policy Institute's Josh Bivens, who's the Director of Research and Policy. Josh, you recently released a paper looking at how fiscal and tax policy can both grow the economy, reduce inequality. So why don't you continue the conversation from here?
Thank you. Yeah, the paper, which is co-authored with Hunter Blair, who's a tax and budget expert at EPI, we wrote it for this conference based, like everybody else, on very different premises. But in that paper, we highlighted what we called the three main fiscal challenges of the country. And the first challenge is to finally lock in a full recovery and genuine full employment and keep future fiscal cliffs from keeping us from staying at full employment. That's the first challenge. Second big fiscal challenge in our view is paying in the long run for the large, relatively efficient single-payer health system in the United States, Medicare and Medicaid, in the face of per-enrollee health costs that are growing faster than the overall economy. Anytime someone shows you sort of a scary-looking graph about projected deficits in the United States over the next 30 years, that's healthcare. It's entirely healthcare. It's nothing but healthcare. That is the fiscal challenge, figuring out a way to either manage healthcare costs more efficiently or just raise the revenue needed to pay for them. And then the third sort of big fiscal challenge we identified was using fiscal policy as the most direct, reliable lever to push back on rising inequality, and doing it through two ways. On the spending side, doing transfers to low and moderate income households to boost their income, and then on the tax side, raising top marginal tax rates to reduce the incentives for really well-placed economic actors to rig the rules of the game to send more money their way. And so those are the three challenges we identified. Since I'm not a complete hack, I'm here to tell you, even after the election, I still think those are the three big fiscal challenges in front of us. The question is just how effectively are they going to be addressed going forward. So I'm going to say just a couple things about how things look. On the first issue, locking in full recovery in the near term, I think we're, as Dean noted, we're in the really ironic position of probably being closer to achieving that in the next couple of years than we were before the election, and I'll say a little bit more about that. I think one thing that's important to realize is our economy has been sort of sailing steadily towards full employment for quite some time. You know, for the past couple of years, I've been with Dean arguing we are not there yet. We still need further support. We need further help. We need to not subvert the recovery. But we've been sailing pretty steadily there. The unemployment rate has been halved since its peak in the immediate post-recession era. The last year, we actually saw the decline in labor force participation that has characterized a lot of the recovery stop and then turn around and rise. That's a really good sign. In the past couple of months, we've actually seen a small uptick in nominal wage growth, which is a sign of sort of labor market recovery. And so we've actually been making progress toward full employment, and even without a fiscal stimulus, even let's say Hillary Clinton had won the presidency and we had a divided government and there was no fiscal stimulus at all over the next year, even in that situation, we'd have had continued improvement in the economy and likely a substantially lower unemployment rate about a year, 18 months from now. So I think one terrible irony about all this is, like, in terms of the macroeconomy, like everything else in his life, Donald Trump has kind of found himself on third base, and he probably thinks he hit a triple, but he has really found himself inheriting something that is in fundamentally good shape, and he's probably going to get a lot of credit for making it even a bit better just by passing some of the policies he's thinking about. And so just two quick things. The degree to which we should have been at full employment a long time ago. It's more than 7 years into the official recovery. What has held us back is austerity. And basically, you've had the past 6 or 7 years, lots of progressives really begging policymakers for a little more tinder to help the economy heat up even more and get back to full recovery. And we've been told by the Congressional Congress, nope, no water for you, fire's dangerous. In fact, they've sort of flicked water on the recovery the whole time and tried to throttle it. And now we've got the irony that the Congressional Republicans and Donald Trump are going to come running at the fire with a big bucket of kerosene. We're going to get serious stimulus on sort of both sides of the ledger. On the tax side, oh, and just one issue on that as well. We all know that Republicans claim to want to reduce deficits and debt always and everywhere, but we know they don't. You know, what they really want to do is lower taxes on rich people, They've got a sort of secondary preference, very secondary to that, of wanting to clamp down on non-defense spending, especially non-defense discretionary spending, which is where a lot of means-tested and income support programs are. And they want to do this when Democrats are in charge, when that's when it'll be a drag on the economy. But when they're in charge, and they're in charge, we're going to get a really large fiscal stimulus from the tax cut. It's going to be really inefficient. Like if I could spend, who knows what the final bill on that tax cut will be, $700 billion per year. We could all spend $700 billion a year and create 4 times as many jobs and as much economic activity as that tax cut will create, but it's big enough, even though it's inefficient, that it's going to provide a substantial fiscal stimulus to the economy. Then you've got the infrastructure plan. And I feel like the infrastructure plan that'll be an interesting one to look at. I mean, Trump wants infrastructure. He's kind of a building fetishist, and he's run on infrastructure. The GOP Congress seems pretty lukewarm. Democrats generally want infrastructure, and they should. It's a really good policy. And so I would say all else equal, as sort of gross it is to form even temporary issue-based coalitions with authoritarian bigots, that should be a slam dunk. The Democrats should jump on this and support an infrastructure plan. It provides real help to American workers, and it gets Trump crosswise a bit with congressional Republicans. And as a general rule, the more time Trump and congressional Republicans spend not agreeing on things in the next 4 years, I think it's a better world for the rest of us. I mean, 2 details make it a little less of a slam dunk. It's going to be accompanied by a really terrible corporate tax giveaway, almost surely. It's going to be allegedly financed with a repatriation holiday, which I don't want to get into the details, but financing something with a long-run tax cut has never made a lot of sense to me. That doesn't sound like finance. And it's also just a big giveaway to corporations, and so there's that. And then, as Dean mentioned, the Trump plan so far has incredibly sketchy details, but it seems really premised on doing as much of this privately with little oversight and with lots of subsidies to private investors as possible. Are these going to be poison pills that should have Democrats oppose it? I mean, who knows? Precise details are going to matter a lot. I mean, I think the one thing people should think about is that opposing it and losing, you should realize the economy is going to be a lot better a year or 2 from now than it is today, because it's going to get a lot of fiscal stimulus. And so do you want to be on the side of opposing something that people are going to associate with a much better economy? That's going to be a tough position for a lot of people to be in. All right, so that's enough on the short term, the first fiscal challenge. On the second big fiscal challenge, paying for America's single-payer health system. And outlook for this looks pretty bad. There's going to be a major push to block grant Medicaid. There's a theoretical block grant formula for anything that is not a disaster. That's not the one we're going to get. We've seen that again and again. There's going to be some effort, perhaps. There seems to already be some disagreement between Trump and congressional Republicans on voucherizing Medicare. All of this constitutes a cost shift of health care obligations from the federal government's ledger to the ledger of American families. And this is deeply, it's not just, in my mind, cruel, sending the cost to people who are not well placed to board. It's also deeply inefficient. The meds, sort of the Medicare and Medicaid system, they're really good insurance brokers. They have done a much better job of constraining healthcare costs than the private market has over the past 30 years. And so that cost shift isn't just a cost shift one for one, it actually increases how much American families have to pay, either through taxes or through premiums, for the health care they're going to get. So it's a deeply perverse thing to do. The silver lining here is that the Medicare and Medicaid are popular, and they have constituencies. Even Medicaid, I mean, because it's directed mostly to a quite poor population, people think it's quite defenseless. I don't think that's quite right. I mean, for one, I think most people don't realize it's different from Medicare, and so they just sort of associate it with that, and it's got a lot of popular support. 2, Medicaid provides lots of income to doctors and hospitals. They have so far been astonishingly weak in leveraging that sort of, the fact that Medicaid was not taken up by all 50 states, the Medicaid expansion in the Obamacare, that to me shows how weak hospitals and doctors are in exerting political power relative to their incomes, but maybe someday they actually can exert some heft and save some of the Medicaid. So I think there's a little bit of hope there. And then finally, I think the history of the American sort of social insurance state, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Republicans are pretty scared about unilaterally hacking away at them. I think lots of Republicans and lots of Republican think tanks have an ideological commitment to doing that. But for the past generation, the game has really been, we are willing to do it only if we can fool enough Democrats or scare enough Democrats to come along with us. And so it feels bipartisan, and we're not going to get all the blame for taking a hack at these deeply popular programs. My hope is that the Democratic caucus has mostly learned that game and is not going to be in a very, in a mood to join Republicans in attacking that. And so I would never use the word optimistic to describe how I feel over the next 2 to 4 years. I don't think those programs are quite as defenseless as we think. I think you already see little wedges developing between Trump and Congress. And so I think that's the only thing that makes me not in total despair about the prospect of meeting the second or sustaining the second big fiscal challenge, which is paying for health care. The third one, I can be really short. I mean, the third big fiscal challenge we talked about was using fiscal policy to reduce inequality and push back on the rise in inequality. I mean, that's a dead letter for the next 2 to 4 years. I mean, elections matter. We're not going to be using fiscal policy to reduce inequality anytime until we have a substantially different set of policymakers.
Well, thank you, Josh. I think. But, piggybacking on that last point, even though it may be sort of dead on arrival in terms of potential policy avenues, what would you advise people to be for in terms of reducing inequality? Because part of, the whole next 4 years will involve not only playing defense and trying to make potentially terrible things less bad, but also articulating, at least to a constituency that's in despair, what is the path forward? So what would you say there people should associate and attach themselves with that could actually reduce inequality?
Yeah, and so we write about it in the paper, so it's sitting on every table, and we have a section on that. I mean, really briefly, and why we said progressive revenue was really key to meeting that particular fiscal challenge. One, the spending the federal government does tends to be really progressive. It does a lot of transfers to low and moderate income people with food stamps, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare. And so anytime you can beef up transfer payments to low and moderate income households that have largely been left out of economic growth over the past generation, you've helped. And then we point to sort of a growing recognition in the tax literature that historically low top marginal tax rates, the tax rate faced by very well-placed economic actors like CEOs and financial sector professionals, that really provides a big incentive for them to bargain as hard as possible, to engage as much rent-seeking as possible. I mean, the quick way to think about this, there was once a guidebook for people who sat on corporate boards in the 1970s, and one piece of advice to them was don't pay your CEO $1 million because no CEO is worth $1 million. And that's hilarious in retrospect because they all make so much more than that now. But then the second point was, why would you pay them that much anyway? The top marginal tax rate is 70 to 90%, and so they don't even get to take it home. Well, we all know what's changed. The top marginal tax rate is nowhere near that high, and so all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense for CEOs to demand really, really high pay packages because they get to keep a lot more of it. And so I think the fact, recognizing that bargaining channel with high marginal rates was another big issue in reducing inequality through progressive taxes.
Okay. Jane, you want to comment?
Actually, there's a specific suggestion for something to consider that I'd make, and it's been supported by Democrats in Congress and also by President Obama, which is to expand the earned income tax credit for families without children. There are a lot of lower-income working people who don't have children, and their earned income tax credit rate is like 7.6% or something like that, whereas for families with children, it's like 34%. So, I mean, that's one policy. The earned income credit, in general, is a way that transfers income probably without any kind of stigma of a welfare program to lower and middle income workers. So that program has worked pretty well. I mean, it gets criticized sometimes for like everything, but it probably works more efficiently actually than a lot of transfer programs because it's automatic. I think probably there are a lot of maybe some immigrants who are left out of that program, but that's a good one to think about. Specific one to think about.
Thank you.
I'll give my quick
Absolutely.
one. I'll talk about this this afternoon, but for those of you who are just here this morning, financial transactions tax. I'm a huge fan of that. One, you could raise a lot of revenue. My calculation's over $100 billion a year. But the other reason why I just love this tax is that it all comes out of the financial sector. So the analysis, not just mine, just about everything I've seen on this, it assumes that the elasticity, the reduction in trading volume is as large or larger than the amount you raise in taxes. So just say we're getting $100 billion in tax revenue for the government, most research shows that we'll reduce trading volume by at least $100 billion. And a net trading is not a gain. I might lose, you might win, but that on net is not a gain. So if you eliminate $100 billion of wasteful trading, that's income for a lot of the richest people in the country. I don't mind seeing them lose it. You get rid of a lot of wasteful activity, and government raises a lot of money. So that's my favorite.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to have questions from the audience. I want to give you a second. Well, you know, I see a clamor. So we'll intersperse my questions with your questions. Why don't we start with Mitzi in the front row? And do we have microphones going around? Okay. Sorry, Lucy, I didn't give you any advanced warning.
Thank you. I'm not an economist, I'm a social anthropologist. So I didn't understand a lot of what you said because it's in code. You talk to one another in code. First, I would say I think the gross domestic product as a metric is not informative because what you really need to understand is not the average, but what happens at the bottom 5%, the bottom 10%, whatever. Averaging it out doesn't inform me as to how bad the distribution is. Secondly, I think it's time we start explaining these complex systems so the general public can understand it. By God, is that hard. But there was a program out in California and San Francisco where it was called CalFresh, and they were trying to figure out how to get all basically the people living on the street to understand what were all the programs that they could take advantage of. And they hired a group from something called Code for America, these young techies. And they went out and interviewed the people on the street to find out how they could explain the story to them, and they could actually get access to these programs. It was written up last Sunday in the Sunday New York Times Magazine section. And what was interesting was these kids started on the right-hand side of the page saying, where do we want to end up? And they looked at all the inhibitors in the system that made it so impossible for them to figure out how to get it. And I'm just suggesting starting to explain this to the public. It's very hard. You can set up competitions to get people to do it. But if the public doesn't understand it, they constantly lose out. It gets more and more complicated. Alan Alda created a program called The Flame, where he decided to figure out how to explain complex science to 11-year-olds. I think we need to do the same thing for the general public on how the government works. It's all a process. You can't just say we have the tax, the RSA, and that's it. You have to just explain how it works.
Well, Mitzi, I think your comment is certainly timely and appropriate, given that simple messages, at least at the presidential level, predominated this year. So there's some, at least, recent evidence that that is in fact correct. And if I could just take that into a question for the panelists. You know, Jane, you kind of gave us the way forward on looking at tax expenditures, where the money is, what's inefficient, what could be more efficient. If there was a guiding ethos and philosophy to how we should think about tax expenditures in terms of what their role is and how they should be designed and developed to promote both efficiency and fairness, how would you sum it up?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is say, would we do this as a direct spending program? And, you know, why would we engage in all of these broad subsidies, you know, that don't have any economic sense? I mean, they don't obtain it. Most of them don't achieve any kind of efficiency gain. Why would we have subsidies for retirement programs and savings programs that are mainly for high-income people who save anyway? So, I mean, if you think, would I hand out money directly? I think that's the first step in thinking about it. And the other thing, I mean, Mitzi, I don't know your last name. I understand your problem. I mean, I have to try to explain a lot of very complex issues to people who often are not familiar with them. I think part of the problem with what I saw in the election when I sort of heard people interviewed about why they wanted to vote for Trump, I think, first of all, they really don't understand the economy. So these people interviewed in Gettysburg said, oh, well, all the manufacturing jobs left because of NAFTA and government regulations. Well, that is just not true. I mean, manufacturing jobs changed primarily because of technology, because of labor-saving technology. So we need somehow to make people understand that most of the things in the economy that affect their lives are driven by the economic system and not by government changes. So the people who think that the manufacturing jobs are going to come back, I mean, they will have an education soon because they won't. So
Okay.
that need to get told.
Sure. Thank you. Indeed. And Dean, if I could ask you, you're someone who talks to popular audiences a lot about this, and if we could sift through words like stimulus, which, certainly resonate in this crowd, but not much for the American people, as you would sort of explain kind of the role of the economy not just being something that works on autopilot, but that can be designed to achieve certain outcomes, how would you say it to lay audiences?
Well, one of the big things I think is when we start using really big numbers that we lose people, because understandably, no one in their right mind knows, we say, oh, this is going to be $1 trillion over the next decade. Okay, probably most of the people here have some idea what that means. Let's go down the street. Why on earth would anyone know what $1 trillion is over the next decade? So I generally try to say, okay, what is this per person? How large is it relative to your, the tax bill? How large is it to the economy? Something that at least puts it in relation to things. And this is something that, I'm not advertising my blog. I'm just saying that one of the things I do, Beat the Press, I write on economic reporting, primarily on like the Post and Times. And one of the things I've harangued these people on endlessly is that they'll report on a spending program. We're going to spend $20 billion on TANF. I don't know the exact number, but it's probably something like that. So that's our main welfare program. Someone hears $20 billion on TANF, they go, oh, that's where all my tax dollars are going. That's a lot of money. And you go, okay, well that's half of 1% of the budget. Okay, so maybe you don't like it, but everyone should know whether you like TANF, you don't like TANF, you're not getting more money in your pocket even if we eliminate it altogether. And this is the simplest thing in the world. I've never had one reporter try to tell me that that was meaningful. And I thought I had this big breakthrough when I got the public editor at the New York Times to write about this, and she got David Leonhardt, who was then the Washington editor, to go, that's right, this is just like saying really big number, so we'll start putting in percentages. Pick up the paper a day? No. So, that is something that's simple. We should be able to change. And no, I don't think if we do that, everyone's going to understand the budget. But I think they'll get us a lot closer. And I'd love to see that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. We've got lots of questions. I'll go around the room. I see a gentleman here at the second table on the inset.
So this is just to follow up on the comment on messaging. I absolutely agree with Jane that earned income credit for the bottom of the scale is great. Lots of Republicans like it too. But we also need to worry about the top. And instead of talking about reducing inequality, we need to start thinking about stopping the Republicans from increasing inequality at the top. So the number one priority, I think, is defending the estate tax. Politics of it are fraud. There's been a lot written about it, but I'm quite confident that something like 90% of people have no idea about taxation of inheritances. They don't know that they're exempt from income tax. They have no idea what the limits are. So the message needs to go out now because we have a window of a few months before the Republicans repeal the estate and gift tax. It needs to be explained to people. Just explain to people what is current law. And then, you can make comments. But if people just understood what the current law was, that would be a big benefit. It's a huge exemption.
So thank you very much. Jane, do you want to take a stab at it? And then Josh, I want to go to you on that same question within the context of the budget.
I think that's a case where a percentage might help because I'm not sure exactly what the percentage, I haven't written them for a while, and I do handle the estate tax. But I think it's like 0.2% of decedents or something like that are going to be subject to the estate tax. And so that, they were never able to find a businessman whose business failed because of the estate tax. I used to get questions like, how many farmers in Alabama will pay the estate tax? And my estimate was a half a farmer, maybe. So, I mean, to communicate this notion that the estate tax is actually very much confined to high-income people. There's a marital deduction. There's a lot of schemes, too, like the minority discount scheme. We could look also at some reforms to expand the estate tax. But I think this is a case where those percentages, if you could I have papers that say that, but, the general public doesn't read those papers.
Josh, do you want to comment at all? You don't have to if you don't want.
Two quick things. So we mention in our paper both the estate tax as well as doing away with something that sounds pretty technical, but the step-up basis, which basically is people who, when they leave estate to somebody else, the decedents only have to they don't have to pay tax on the accumulated capital gain over the entire lifetime. So if my grandfather bought a share of GE in 1900 and then gives me the shares as an inheritance, I don't have to pay on any of the accumulation over that time period. And so that's another way that just huge amounts of wealth are allowed to be transferred without ever getting any taxation at all. The estate tax is a mystery to me. I mean, I feel like progressives for the past 20 years have been trying to explain how few people it hits, how large are the estates, and it's been so hard to get traction. I think you're right, we have to keep trying, but it's been amazing to me how hard that one has been to actually get popular support for.
Could I make a couple quick points? There was, on the issue of the ignorance of it, David K. Johnson, who's a great reporter, used to be at the Times, back in 2001 when Bush was pushing through the repeal of the estate tax, was called the Farm Bureau, had been a big opponent, saying all these family farms have been lost because of the estate tax. So he said, could you give me a name of someone who lost their farm because of the estate tax? They couldn't give him a single person in the whole country. The other point on this is that he did a lot of great reporting back, well, he still does great reporting, but he went around and he found all these small businesses that had insurance policies to cover their estate tax if they were to die suddenly. And these were businesses that no way on earth would have owed a penny in the estate tax. So in other words, you have a lot of people that have these, they have 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 in their business. They're worried, oh my God, I want to be able to pass this on to my kids. They can. It's not going to touch them. And, they think, this is, economists like to say, we look at what people do, not what they say. They're shelling out the money. They really think that it's going to hit them.
Thank you. Okay, young lady here in the second row, in the green.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you, Jeff, for hosting this workshop. So, so far as the panel is concerned, I was thinking a federal budget for equity and fairness. What we need to do is have issues that both sides can agree on, and I found two. One is getting rid of tax incentives. I don't think it's right that millionaires and billionaires pick our pockets to make their profits. Now, I know two people in the Senate, you wouldn't believe it, who actually agree. Ted Cruz on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left. You wouldn't think they'd agree on anything, but they both agree we need to get rid of tax incentives. What do? We invest them in our communities, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural. We invest them in small business. That's how the country started, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. We invest them, like a co-op grocery store. You could have one in urban, suburban, and rural, and have people making money, and more importantly, the money stays in the community. You have a co-op store, they'll go to the store in the community, it stays in the country, whereas tax incentives, they go to all over, out of the country, tax shelters, what have you, and it doesn't come back to us. So my point is, the reason why this stuff doesn't happen is because politics get in the way. So how do we get politics out of the way to get policy in the way, get policy there to make this happen? Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and I think it was discussed within the context of infrastructure, and then you also have tax expenditures where, at least on a top line level, you may see room for collaboration where I'm not sure you have further agreement is on the proper use of whatever savings or efficiencies you would get from that. So whereas your prescribed methods are probably not ones that Ted Cruz would adopt, but certainly on that top line there is agreement. So I'd love to, as part of your responses, you could also include the big infrastructure conversation, since that is coming up. And how do you deal with a world where you may have top line agreement, but when it gets to the details, there's very much a different approach to how you go about it. So Dean, you want to start off since you mentioned it specifically?
Sure. I mean, we're going to run a really big risk with the infrastructure plan that Donald Trump and the Republicans are going to be putting forward, because they obviously will be looking for this privatization, and almost invariably this ends up being real shams. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a matter of bargaining. We're going to have to try and limit that as much as possible. And again, Josh raised the point, Jane may have as well, that do we really want to bargain with this guy? And people might say no, and I don't think that's necessarily the wrong answer. I'm not saying it's the right answer, not necessarily the wrong answer, but what you have to try to do is limit that as much as possible. And the other thing is to try to highlight it. So go, okay, you want to give your buddy $1 billion to build this highway that we could do for $500 million if we're done through the public sector. We're going to make sure everyone knows about it, and this is going to stay with you for however long this issue's there.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, if you want to, the problem with tax incentives is just as you said, you have to go through them item by item and work. I mean, you just can't say get rid of tax expenditures, because some of them are very difficult to do. For example, with pensions, how do you can't even probably legally attribute income from pensions to people, because we have this very powerful constructive receipt requirement in our law that unless you've actually gotten something, you don't usually pay taxes on it. In this particular case, what's the value of my pension? What was it when I was 30 years old? So it's very, very hard to do some of this stuff. Some of it is extremely popular. The mortgage interest deduction is very popular. Tom Hungerford, again, years ago, we wrote a paper where we went item by item through the individual tax expenditures. It was called The Challenge of Individual Income Tax Reform. And not all of these provisions are undesirable. There are some desirable ones. But I think also, I was asked mostly to talk about individual taxes, but there are huge, not even part of tax expenditures, revenue losses in the corporate sector among multinationals. There's this huge amount, very large amount of money that is shifted, profits that are shifted to places like the Cayman Islands and Bermuda that really should be taxed. My own opinion is the money that the European Union is trying to impose, the tax the European Union wants to impose on Apple is really our money and not Ireland's or Europe's or whoever wants to get it. So there's just no substitute for going through item by item and then trying to gain some kind of consensus, and that's just very hard to do. So,
How do we find your argument?
Okay, hold on. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You give me your card and I'll send it to you.
Great, thank you. All right, I see this gentleman here at this table, Lucy.
Thank you. My name's Bill Parks. Is it on? Right. Okay, thank you. I'd like to make two suggestions. One of them is on the capital gains rate. Why not say $150,000 a year times the number of years that you've held the asset? Therefore, that farmer that we were talking about who sells after 40 years, or that business person after 20, the farmer would get whatever that would be, 6 million in the, or 44.5, and you understand what I'm saying. In other words, and the hedge fund manager would get $150,000 every year of capital gains, and the rest of it would be ordinary income. Therefore, the people often bring up the small farmer or the retiring small business owner, and they would get an advantage, make it only not just capital gains, but let's say go back down to 15%. So that's my first point. And the second thing is having to do with the question of the earned income tax credit, because the people on low income but making more than that are paying for the businesses that are not giving the $15 an hour thing. So it's really being paid by the workers to the businesses that are not paying a decent wage.
So, Jane, go ahead.
Well, if you want to help wages of low-income workers, there's two potential ways to do it, and they both have their advantages. One is through something like the earned income credit, where you give people a credit for their wages, and that doesn't change the wage to employers, or you can increase the minimum wage. The increasing, as I said, they both have advantages and disadvantages. They're just two sides of the same coin. So your capital gains proposal, I'm not quite sure I understand it, but you're proposing to have a dollar amount regardless of how much capital gains you've received, a dollar amount of exemption. I think that would benefit high-income people a great deal.
No, the maximum would be $150,000 if anything you tell over a year. But if you tell it 10 years, then you get 1.5 million.
Are you saying that's the amount you want to tax or the amount you want to exempt?
That's the amount you want to exempt.
Okay, that's what I thought you were
From
saying.
regular income. Everything
Oh.
above that is regular income.
Oh, okay, so you're going to tax that at capital gains rates and the other. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting proposal. I'll have to think about it.
Interesting idea to explore. One that these economists would probably want to think about before giving you definitive comment on. All right, I see hands in the back. Okay, thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, I just had a brief question. My question was talking about what the U.S. economy can do as far as taxes to make it more, I want to say, valuable in a global economy. When you look at the euro and how they are becoming a much more international, I guess, dominating the currency in terms of the euro, I don't think raising taxes in the United States is going to help really make us a competitor when the value of the dollar is losing out compared to the British euro.
All right, so let's think about that. I think the underlying philosophy in that question is something that you hear a lot. Would the United States make itself non-competitive, both on a corporate level and produce bad economic outcomes on the personal income tax level if we looked at raising revenues through the tax code? This is a fundamental, guiding or bright line between different people. Dean.
Well, a couple points. For better or worse, we don't have to worry that much about the euro as competition. I wish we did. I mean, European economies are doing pretty bad. I mean, again, I'm not happy about that. I'm just saying realistically that shouldn't be a fear. But in terms of, competitiveness to the U.S., I guess I'd make 2 points. One is that we can certainly tax more, but part of it is taxing better, and particularly with the corporate tax rate. I mean, it is a mess, and if we could ever get an honest discussion that was focused on cleaning up the corporate tax code that wasn't trying to do big giveaways, that would be great. So I'm not necessarily, I'm happy to get a little more corporate tax revenue, but the big thing would be cleaning it up. But the other point is, companies look for a lot of things when they make their locational decisions, and tax rates obviously are one of them, but a relatively unimportant factor. And again, we've done a lot of research. I think Jane's done some of it. It's just not that big a deal. Obviously, can you get, pay a lower tax rate? Sure, you're happy to do it. I remember Paul O'Neill, who was George W. Bush's first Treasury Secretary. He was asked about tax cuts. He had been the head of Alcoa and paper company, International Paper, so he's obviously familiar with the business world. He goes, I don't know any business executive that ever invested because of tax breaks. So we'll take them if you give them to us. But that's not why you invest. And the point is you need good infrastructure, well-educated workforce. There's a lot of things that businesses are looking for. They don't all go to the lowest tax country. They go to ones that have a lot of good infrastructure, good workforce, countries like Germany, for example. And if we sacrifice that to get a lower tax rate, we're losing.
Well, again, this is another situation where we really need to understand fundamental economics. And so our objective, I think, in our tax code should be to choose provisions that give us an efficient allocation of resources. So we don't care so much about being globally competitive, although surely, we certainly are. Our corporations are all over the world. Everybody has Apple phones and they Google and all, so we have a very much large, huge multinational corporate sector. But we should not be concerned about anything except allocating our resources, our labor, our savings to the places where it's best used, will earn the highest rate of return. And the second thing about where you locate, there is a difference between where you locate your factories and your operations and where you locate your profits. And taxes do matter there, and this is an area where we could gain a good deal of revenue if we could get together on something to do it. I mean, the estimates, Reuven probably knows better than I do, but somewhere around $60 billion maybe a year is lost because people are operating, are operating in the Bermuda or the British Virgin Islands. Our multinational income in the Cayman Islands, now we're talking about real versus paper, is over 2,000% of the GDP of the Cayman Islands. So obviously, nothing real is going on there. There's a little tourist business there and a big house called Uglin House that's filled with a bunch of file drawers of corporations. So we need to focus on some of those differences too.
Lucy, we'll go to the back, and then I've got a couple more in the front that'll close us out.
Thank you. Ezra Levin, I wanted to dig into Josh's comments, the comment that the smart play here would be to partner with Trump on infrastructure, which really does seem like a smart three-dimensional chess move for a Bush or McCain or Romney type. But in your own words, what we're up against is not that. We're up against, again, an authoritarian bigot. So I'm wondering, given that, is it really the smart move to risk empowering and normalizing somebody who is appointed white nationalist to his inner circle and whose representatives are speaking positively about Japanese internment? Thanks.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I mean, two things. One, I think in the very narrow details of the infrastructure thing, there are a lot of details that are going to matter, even aside from the very sui generis nature of the Trump presidency. If it is just purely a sort of nest of graft and giveaways and really flawed public-private partnerships, that there'd probably be enough substantively to say that this is bad enough that we don't want this infrastructure bill. I think mediating against that is just the fact that you have to try really hard to mess up an infrastructure bill so bad that is not going to deliver some benefits to the U.S. economy. And I think that the political risk is the one I mentioned before, which is I think we're in for, in terms of macroeconomic aggregates, I mean, the rest of society is going to be terrible, but in terms of macroeconomic aggregates, it's going to be a pretty decent next couple of years unless something really off my radar happens. I don't see where recession comes from, where a slowdown comes from, especially if we do a bunch of fiscal stimulus. And then the question becomes, does that success become entirely attributed to a sort of Trump presidency and the GOP Congress, or can the Democrats claim some of it and say, yeah, we've been asking for 6 or 7 years for more spending, for more infrastructure spending, and when it finally got kicked through, the economy improved a lot. And so we want to take that as sort of a partial vindication of what we've been calling for a long time. It's a tough call. I think it's mostly going to fall on the details. And then the last thing, I think it's sort of true. It's not obvious to me how smooth a sailing an infrastructure bill has. Like, my strong sense is that Republican members of Congress are not super enthused by it. That they're not reflexively big infrastructure spenders, as far as I understand it. They tend to mock estimates that we have an infrastructure deficit. I think that's not one where I have a strong ex-ante recommendation. Yes, we should be all in or all out on this. I think it's going to depend a lot on the details, but I do think people should really keep the overall context in mind, which is, if you're not in favor of this and it gets passed, there's a strong possibility we have a much stronger looking economy in the aggregates a year or two from now. And then the question about who gets credit for that and whose policies are vindicated versus those that are not, that's going to be a real issue.
And perhaps an alternative is to, between resistance and partnering, is to claim credit for everything that happens with it that may be positive and disavow everything that's not. And I don't mean that glibly. Dean.
I'll just say something quickly. I mean, I basically agree with pretty much everything Josh said, but I'll just add, there have been some people saying we're going to have a horrible recession. And I just don't see that. I mean, we could all hate the guy, but that doesn't make it mean he's going to have a recession. And, again, I was being a little glib when saying we can't be economic deniers, but I'll repeat that. We can't ignore the economy isn't going to act the way we want it to act. We have to try to do our best understanding, and we may come to disagreements, but we have to try and do our best understanding of the economy and can't say, oh, it's going to do bad things because we don't like Donald Trump. That's not the way the world works.
Okay. Lucy, where are you? You're here, and then we'll hopefully get the last two. Rachel.
Hi, my name is Terry Ryan. I'm here with the Daily Ripple, but my comment / question is more just as an individual person, and it has to do about the estate tax. And I guess it's to put it out there as far as the estate tax. I think there's a much more equitable way to frame it. And to you on the end, you said about one family farm who had been, couldn't come up with one name of had been affected. I will say that disproportionately, family farms that are located in like the middle Atlantic states and the Northeast are the kind that actually do lose their farms because of the estate tax. And also depending on what year your in my case, my mother died, was one of the years that, from estate tax being a political football, was a very high watermark as far as 55% for federal estate, not including that Pennsylvania also has a whatever. So to say that is, I grew up on a family farm in Pennsylvania. It was just dollars when it was bought. Because of its location and its location to 78 and New York, its appraisal went through the ceiling, and my sister and I did have to sell it because we could not afford the estate tax. Collectively, we did not have the assets to pay the estate tax on what the land had been valued at, and had tried to go through the insurance policy route. Again, many of the family farms are land rich and money poor, so did not have the income to pay for an insurance contract to pay off the estate tax. Thank you.
Well, obviously, I don't know the specifics. I will just say, I was referring to the Farm Bureau could not identify a single, so it's not me personally. The Farm Bureau couldn't identify a single family. And I will just add that, again, I don't know anything about your personal situation. There's a large zero bracket, and then on top of that, I believe there's a 10-year period, which you have to pay it. Again, I don't know anything about your personal situation. That may have not worked out for whatever reason, but there's already provisions in the law to try and accommodate family farmers.
Yeah, if I could just add, there are a whole series of provisions for businesses, for farms to value land at its use instead of the market value. So there are a lot of benefits and a long period to pay. But the estate tax now is much, much smaller. I mean, it is much, much smaller. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but I believe about 2% of people are 2% or so, maybe a little more, paid estate taxes under the old estate tax rules. I mean, this is tiny now. So, I mean, we're talking about an estate tax that has a $5.5 million exemption. So now, but that was not true in the past. In the past, probably at the time, you don't say what year, but there was like 600,000, 700,000, something like that. So, I mean, you have to realize this is not your mother's estate tax world. This is a new one that is really, really confined to very high-income people. And as I said, no one was ever able to find a farmer that lost his farm. I mean, that's the story I've heard as well. So.
Okay, I think we have time just for one more question. Or maybe not. Lucy, we have one over here.
Hi, thanks so much for this important discussion. I'm Rachel West, Center for American Progress. So I think that it's great that we've been having a lot of conversation about infrastructure, considering that it's probably the only thing moving forward from progressive standpoint. So wherever we can agree would be wonderful, in my opinion. But if this were to move forward from a progressive or democratic standpoint, like, we would look like a very different package, as you've all articulated. And I think it would include infrastructure broadly defined, so maybe like job training, workforce development, education, and so on, as well as the very valuable and needed roads, bridges, highways. Is that an area, so stuff like jobs training, that maybe Trump could agree his constituency would want, where progressives could and should spend their political capital when having infrastructure conversations, and what would be those possibilities in addition to maybe workforce development, subsidized employment?
Throw that question to Josh first, since he's done some recent writing that I know of about thinking about infrastructure broadly and beyond just construction projects and roads.
Yeah, so over the past couple of years at EPI, we've written a couple things, because I certainly believe we do have an infrastructure deficit, and infrastructure generally refers to what most people think of it, but highways, transit, water systems, utilities. But then there's other categories of sort of public investment that are outside that non-core infrastructure that also can provide really large economic returns for the country. And so some of the high ones on my list would be like early childhood education. How is that not, public investment in the clearest sense of the term? And so we were, back when we were planning for a Hillary Clinton administration who also had an infrastructure plan they were going to try to push, we were writing up ways to expand the pot of stuff being called public investment that we should spend money on in this period. One benefit is it's a little overstated, but it's not entirely untrue that core infrastructure is mostly a construction jobs program. It's not just construction. They have to buy a lot of materials. There's a respending multiplier. They go out and buy clothes and other things. But the first dollar really does go to a pretty specific industry that is very heavily male. It's not quite as white as people think it is. It's pretty Latino as well. But still, you can definitely say this is not a hugely broad-based way to inject money directly into the economy. And so besides the sort of investment benefits of a broader portfolio of public investments, you also get the direct money to a more diverse group of workers. And so I'm totally in favor of it. I would love that. I think people should push for it. I mean, frankly, I think the fact that it is narrow on a specific group of workers is probably one reason why a Trump administration will like a poor concrete only infrastructure plan. But I absolutely do think progressives should try to expand the pot of what we consider public investment for sure.
If I could just throw in something quickly on that. I hope in terms of expanding one of the things, even in the core concrete, we could talk about mass transit. I mean, we haven't said a word about global warming. We have a president who thinks it's a Chinese hoax. This is something we have to be mindful of, and in some ways, I think it might be the worst thing of a Trump administration. Well, that's a hard thing to say. It'll be the worst, but we don't have time here. So if we go 4 years, let's hope not longer, where we make a point of not doing anything on global warming, we don't get that time back. So we should try to be mindful of that.
And I'll just say, certainly the panel as it was delivered today was a lot different than what it was conceptualized when this event was put together. So we first need to acknowledge and thank Dean, Josh, and Jane for being able to reframe the tenor and timbre of their conversation in light of last week's events. And certainly we can't sum up the wealth of information that was shared this morning through both the presentations and the discussion, but it seems pretty clear, at least to me, that when we think about the way forward, there's going to be areas that, at least on a top line level, may provide some political difficulty for progressives to resist, if that's the term. But clearly with infrastructure, it's not going to be as broad and financed in such a way that meets the economic objectives that we desire. So there's definitely a way forward for progressives to be involved in that fight. When you think about the larger conversations about where the economy is and what should be done with taxes and how to think about deficits, things still stand. The world hasn't changed in that regard. And there's a lot of work that people who want to have an input, not only with speaking to policymakers, but also speaking to the public writ large, have. So this should not be taken as a time for despair. There's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of meaningful work, and I thank Jane, Josh, and Dean for looking at kind of what the economic landscape is and what's the role of thinking about the budget and taxes and specific investments in moving us forward. So let's give them a round of applause.